A single dad sits for a blind date, only to realize he's been flirting with his boss. One innocent mistake triggers office chaos, forbidden tension, and a spark they can't walk away from.
David Parker used to think the hardest part of being a single dad was keeping his 9-year-old daughter, Mia, fed, dressed, and out the door on time every morning. But over the years, he learned that the real challenge was remembering who he was outside of fatherhood and work. His days blurred together. Commutes, deadlines, grocery runs, quick dinners, bedtime stories. And somewhere in the middle of that cycle, he realized he hadn't been on a date in almost 3 years. His best friend, Mark, called that a critical emergency and took it upon himself to set up a blind date for him at a popular cafe downtown. David resisted at first, but after enough teasing and guilt-tripping, he finally agreed. The moment he said yes, though, the nerves kicked in. All week, he felt like he was walking towards some invisible finish line, unsure whether he was excited or terrified. When Friday finally arrived, he spent his entire afternoon in a frantic loop of preparations that felt both ridiculous and strangely important. He opened his closet to find a mountain of clothes he hadn't touched in months, shirts he had outgrown, sweaters with fraying sleeves, jackets that still held the faint smell of an old life. After multiple rounds of trying things on and discarding them, he settled on a navy button-down that Mia insisted made him look like someone who could be on TV. She said it with a grin missing one front tooth, and he couldn't argue with that kind of confidence. Next came grooming. David stood in front of his bathroom mirror with a seriousness usually reserved for job interviews, squinting at his reflection like he was meeting himself for the first time. He trimmed his beard, fixed his hair, and leaned in close, trying to decide whether he looked more charming or sleep-deprived. In the end, he decided he looked like a dad trying his best, which was honest enough. The final task was finding a babysitter, a mission he underestimated badly. He called 3 people in a row, each unavailable for understandable yet inconvenient reasons, and by the time he texted his neighbor, Mrs. Ramirez, he was halfway convinced the universe was telling him not to leave the house. Luckily, Mrs. Ramirez responded within minutes, cheerfully agreeing to watch Mia for the evening. David wasn't sure whether to be relieved or nervous that his last excuse had disappeared. Once Mia was settled, happily showing off her new coloring book to Mrs. Ramirez, he grabbed his keys and forced himself to walk out the door before he changed his mind. The drive to the cafe felt longer than usual, filled with his strange tension, like he was going somewhere important even though he kept reminding himself it was just a date, just a conversation, just 2 people getting to know each other. No pressure. He repeated those words every time he stopped at a red light. When he arrived, the cafe was everything Mark had promised. Warm lighting, shelves lined with plants, an air of effortless coziness, and more people than he expected for a Friday night. The space buzzed with quiet chatter and clinking glasses, and for a moment, he stood awkwardly at the entrance, scanning the tables like a student searching for an assigned seat. His date, according to Mark, would be wearing a light gray jacket and sitting near the window. That detail anchored him. David spotted a woman sitting alone by the large front window, holding a cup of tea with both hands. The soft glow from the street lamp behind her framed her in a warm outline, and she carried herself with a calm, collected presence that immediately made him feel both curious and intimidated. She wore a light gray jacket, neatly folded on the chair beside her, same jacket color, same table number Mark had mentioned. The signs lined up too perfectly for him to doubt it, so he took a deep breath, straightened his shirt one last time, and walked toward her. As he approached, she looked up, her expression shifting from mild surprise to a polite, welcoming smile. "David, right?" she said, her voice steady and warm. The way she said his name made him relax. He nodded, grateful that she seemed friendly and not the least bit disappointed by the person who had approached her table. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, trying to keep his movements smooth, even though every muscle in his body felt stiff with awkward excitement. "Sorry I'm a little early," he said lightly, placing his phone face down on the table to look more confident than he felt. "I wasn't sure how crowded it would be." She laughed softly, a small sound but genuine. "I don't mind. I was just enjoying my tea." Her smile wasn't overly enthusiastic, but it held a kindness that eased some of the tension in his chest. They exchanged a few introductory remarks, how their week had been, the weather, the usual warm-up topics that felt safe when 2 people were still finding a rhythm. The evening unfolded slowly, with a gentle mix of pauses and breakthroughs, and David was pleasantly surprised by how naturally the conversation started to flow. Every now and then, he caught her tilting her head thoughtfully or smiling at something he said in a way that felt unexpectedly encouraging. And yet small oddities drifted through the conversation like tiny red flags he chose to ignore. She asked about his department at work, even though he didn't remember mentioning what he did for a living. She nodded at an inside joke he made about office meetings, something only someone familiar with his workplace would understand. But each time he noted something unusual, he brushed it aside, telling himself he was overthinking things because of nerves. The truth is, he liked talking to her. She seemed intelligent, composed, and surprisingly easy to connect with. The atmosphere helped too. The cafe lights softened everything, giving their table a warm glow that made the moment feel almost cinematic. For the first time in a long while, David allowed himself to feel present, to feel seen, to feel hopeful. As the night carried on, he didn't once consider that he might be sitting at the wrong table, that the gray jacket he used as his guiding sign belonged not to his blind date, but to someone else, entirely. Someone he knew much better than he realized. At that moment, none of that mattered. The mix-up hadn't revealed itself yet, and David, unaware of the chaos waiting to unfold, simply enjoyed the beginning of a night he thought would change his life in one way, never imagining it would end up changing it in completely a different one.
The moment David settled into his seat across from Sarah, the date took on a rhythm that felt both strangely comfortable and faintly confusing, like stepping into a conversation already in progress, yet somehow understanding every part of it. He noticed right away that she carried an air of quiet authority, her posture straight, her gaze steady, her smile controlled but warm enough to make him relax. She asked him how his day had been, and he responded with a light-hearted complaint about paperwork and an overflowing inbox, which made her raise an eyebrow in a way that seemed oddly familiar. Still, he chalked it up to coincidence. Their conversation moved through small dips and rises, starting slow but warming naturally, and soon he found himself laughing more than he expected. Sarah had a sharp, dry humor, the kind that appeared in brief flashes and left him caught between surprise and amusement. She teased him about his nervous energy, pointing out that he kept adjusting his sleeve every time he changed topics. He blushed, admitting she wasn't wrong, and she smiled as if pleased to have noticed something he hadn't even realized he was doing. As the evening continued, they shifted into deeper subjects without realizing it. Childhood memories, favorite movies, dreams they once had before life became so full. David talked about Mia, how she was obsessed with collecting interesting leaves from every park they visited, how she loved helping him cook even though it always doubled the cleanup time. He spoke with the soft pride of a father who had learned to carry joy and exhaustion in the same breath. Sarah listened closely, leaning in when he described the nights Mia couldn't sleep after thunderstorms and how he kept a flashlight with stars on it to help distract her. There was a softness in Sarah's expression during these moments, a gentle curiosity he found disarming. She even asked questions about Mia's school and whether David had any help at home, her tone thoughtful rather than intrusive. But every so often, their conversation would take a sudden turn that didn't make sense, and David would feel a flicker of confusion. When he mentioned his office having a broken coffee machine that refused to be fixed, she let out an amused sigh and said, "Oh, yes, that thing has been dying for months." He blinked. How would she know that? He shrugged it off, assuming his date's friend had told her more about him than he realized. A few minutes later, she joked about his coworker who always wore headphones so big they looked like aircraft gear. And again, he froze, wondering whether Mark had been oversharing or whether this was one more weird coincidence. But Sarah carried on talking so naturally that the odd moments vanished under the ease of their growing rapport. She shared stories too, about a job she said was stressful but fulfilling, about long meetings that drained her energy, about managing people who sometimes acted like rebellious teenagers. David didn't notice how closely her work stories matched those of his own boss. He simply listened, nodding along, thinking she sounded like someone who worked in management or dealt with a lot of responsibility. It impressed him, actually. He liked that she didn't try to sound perfect. She admitted to making mistakes, losing her patience sometimes, and questioning whether she was doing enough for her team. There was something refreshingly honest about her. Their drinks arrived, and David found himself relaxing even more, leaning back in his chair as if the tension of the day had finally dissolved. They laughed about awkward first dates they had experienced, her disastrous dinner with someone who brought a spreadsheet listing his life goals, his unfortunate date with a woman who insisted the earth was shaped like a donut. The laughter felt real, full, and for a moment he wondered if this could be the start of something promising. But beneath the comfort, subtle threads of misunderstanding continued weaving quietly between them. Sarah assumed he knew certain work references and hinted at projects he wasn't familiar with, though she didn't seem to notice his puzzled smile each time. David tried to steer things back to neutral topics whenever conversation drifted too close to his office life, but Sarah somehow kept circling back, slipping in questions that made him feel like he should know the answers. At one point, she casually asked whether he preferred the new scheduling format they recently implemented. David blinked again, his mind scrambling. He forced a laugh and said, "Still getting used to it," hoping that was vague enough to work for any situation. Sarah nodded with a satisfied smile, as if she understood exactly how he felt, and once more the familiarity tugged at him in a way he couldn't quite place. Still, none of the oddness mattered when compared to the strange and effortless chemistry growing between them. She had a presence that drew him in, making him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in years. He found himself telling her stories he didn't expect to share, like how he once got locked out of his own apartment because Mia had, accidentally, turned the deadbolt to keep him from leaving for work, or how he sometimes sat in the car for 5 minutes after arriving home just to have a moment to breathe. Sarah didn't judge him for admitting he was tired or stretched thin. Instead, she nodded with a quiet understanding that felt oddly comforting. Yet, even as he felt himself open up, Sarah was navigating her own internal conversations. She kept observing him with a familiarity she didn't question at first, noting how he fiddled with his watch when uncertain, how his voice softened when he talked about his daughter, how his smile appeared on one side of his face first whenever he was genuinely amused. She felt like she already knew him somehow, and it warmed her more than she expected. Still, she couldn't quite place the feeling. As the evening neared its turning point, their conversation drifted into a space between personal and professional, dangerous territory neither of them recognized yet. Sarah offered a joking comment about how you handled that budget meeting last week, and David almost choked on his drink, his mind spinning, trying to understand how she could possibly know about that meeting when he had never mentioned it tonight. Before he could question it, the cafe door opened and someone stepped inside, someone who would unravel everything. In that quiet, suspended moment, while the stranger scanned the room, David and Sarah remained caught in the warmth of their accidental connection, completely unaware that their carefully balanced misunderstanding was about to crumble in a single breath.
The moment Jenna, from accounting, stepped into the cafe, the comfortable hum of the evening shattered like a glass dropped on tile. Though David didn't notice her at first, he was too busy laughing at something Sarah had just said about how people always seem to remember embarrassing stories better than meaningful ones. But Jenna froze the instant she spotted them by the window, her eyes widening in a way that made it obvious she'd walked straight into gossip gold. She hesitated only long enough to confirm that her eyes weren't tricking her, then marched over with the frantic energy of someone who absolutely needed to understand what she was seeing. "Oh, wow, hi," she blurted, her gaze whipping back and forth between David and Sarah like she was trying to solve a puzzle without being given the box image. David, caught completely off guard, smiled politely and started to introduce her, but Jenna cut him off with an expression that could only be described as delight mixed with shock. "I didn't know you two were out," she said, lowering her voice on the word out as if it were some dangerous secret. David blinked, confused, glancing between Sarah and Jenna. For a split second, he wondered whether Jenna somehow knew his blind date. Maybe she recognized her? Maybe the woman sitting across from him wasn't actually named Sarah and he'd misheard. But then Sarah gave a tight, awkward smile, the kind of smile a person wears when they know something you don't yet. And in that moment, David felt the ground shift beneath the table. "Wait," Jenna whispered, eyes widening as she turned to David. "You do know who you're sitting with, right?" The confusion in David's chest turned into a cold knot. Yes, he answered slowly, though it didn't sound convincing even to himself. Jenna blinked at him like he had just admitted he didn't know water was wet. Then she leaned closer and said it. "David, that's Sarah Hale." The words hung in the air with heavy emphasis, as if they were supposed to immediately trigger recognition. And they did, just not in the way Jenna expected. For a heartbeat, David stared at her blankly because the name Sarah Hale meant nothing in the romantic context he'd imagined tonight, but it meant everything in the professional context he had completely forgotten to consider. Sarah Hale, his boss, his literal boss, the woman who held Monday morning meetings, signed off on budget proposals, and had an office with windows so big they practically needed their own oxygen supply. The realization hit David so hard his breath stuttered. His date, the warm, confident, charming woman sitting across from him, the one he had been joking with for the past hour, was not his blind date at all. She was the CEO he reported to, the woman he had always known from a distance, always professionally, always with the measured respect he believed was appropriate. He'd never once imagined seeing her outside the office, much less sitting with her at a table meant for a romantic evening. "Oh, God," he muttered, hands going cold. "Oh, no, this isn't, oh, man." Sarah held up a hand, stopping his rambling apology. "It's okay," she said gently, though her cheeks were still pink. "Really, I didn't realize either. I thought you knew who I was. When you walked over, I assumed the date was intentional. No, I rubbed his forehead. "I thought you were my blind date." There was a brief moment where they simply stared at each other, both of them processing the sheer absurdity of what had taken place. David wanted to sink into the floor. He wanted someone to roll him out of the cafe on a serving tray and quietly dispose of him behind the dumpster. But then, unexpectedly, Sarah laughed. A real laugh, soft, unfiltered, almost disbelieving. David looked up, startled, and soon he found himself laughing with her, mostly out of helplessness. She breathed, shaking her head. "Honestly, this is the most chaotic thing that has happened to me in months." David groaned with a half laugh, half sigh. "I still can't believe I sat down and acted like everything was normal. A blind date with my own boss. That has to be a new record for workplace disasters." "Well," she said, teasing gently, "at least now I understand why you kept looking confused whenever I mentioned work projects. Because I thought you were just interested," he joked weakly, "not because you were literally the person in charge of them." Sarah covered her mouth, laughing again. The embarrassment neither of them could escape slowly settled into something surprisingly light and almost amusing. It wasn't the romantic evening either of them expected, but it wasn't the catastrophe David feared. The waiter returned to check on them, oblivious to the emotional explosions that had gone off at the table, and they both straightened awkwardly. David vaguely wondered if the waiter thought they were on a date or in the middle of the world's strangest breakup. When he left, Sarah exhaled deeply and offered a small, sincere smile. "Look, despite the mix-up, I actually had a nice time talking to you." David felt his shoulders lower for the first time since Jenna's entrance. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "Me too." The rest of the evening unfolded with a gentler tone, no longer pretending to be a romantic date, but also not reverting to stiff workplace formality. They talked about the absurdity of the situation, laughed at how easily the clues had slipped past both of them, and even compared notes on what each thought was strange during the conversation. By the time the bill arrived, they were no longer embarrassed, just two people who'd stumbled into an unexpected plot twist they would remember for a long time. As they shook hands outside the cafe, David felt a strange warmth beneath the lingering awkwardness. A connection had been made, even if by accident. The night had gone wrong in every technical way, but somehow it didn't feel like a mistake anymore. And yet, neither of them had any idea how this bizarre encounter would ripple into the next morning at the office, into glances, whispers, and a shift neither of them was ready for.
The next morning at the office felt like walking into an alternate universe for David, as though the building had subtly shifted overnight into a place where every wall whispered about him and every doorway hid someone waiting to stare. He arrived earlier than usual, hoping to slip into his cubicle unnoticed and bury himself in emails until his pulse settled, but the moment he stepped into the elevator, he ran straight into Jenna, who greeted him with the kind of smirk that suggested she had already told at least 3 people about the cafe incident. "Morning, David," she said, drawing out his name like it was a punchline. He forced a polite smile and nodded, silently praying she would take pity on him. She didn't. As soon as the elevator doors closed, she raised her eyebrows. "Crazy night, huh?" David stared at his reflection in the metal panel, wondering whether it was possible to fade into mist. "Please," he muttered, "don't start." Jenna laughed, not unkindly, but with too much delight for his comfort. "Relax, I didn't say anything." "Well, not much." His stomach sank. By the time the elevator reached his floor, he felt like he had aged 5 years. He hurried to his desk, hoping to disappear behind his monitor, but his coworkers were already trickling in, each giving him some variation of a look: curious, amused, confused, and occasionally impressed. No one said anything outright, but their glances were too obvious to ignore. He typed pointlessly for a few minutes, pretending to be busy while his heart thumped like a warning drum. He had managed only 20 minutes of fake productivity when he heard the familiar sound of heels clicking down the hallway. He froze. There was only one person in the entire office whose footsteps he recognized instantly: Sarah Hale, his boss, his accidental date. He stared at his keyboard as the clicking grew closer, his breath trapped somewhere between panic and reluctant anticipation. He didn't know whether to stand, hide, or spontaneously evaporate. Before he could decide, she appeared near his desk, poised, calm, professional, and somehow even more intimidating in daylight. "Morning, David," she said, warmly, but her smile flickered at the edges, a brief hint of shared discomfort only he would notice. He swallowed. "Morning." Their exchange lasted 3 seconds, but the tension stretched it into something far longer. She moved on quickly, greeting others, acting as if everything was normal. But the air felt charged in a way that made David's skin tingle. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He needed to get through this day without embarrassing himself. As the morning rolled on, staff gathered for their usual Monday meeting in the conference room, and David tried to sit as far from Sarah as possible without looking suspicious. Unfortunately, Jenna sat next to him with a grin that suggested she planned to enjoy the show. When Sarah walked in, all conversation quieted a bit too quickly, as if everyone was waiting to see how she and David interacted. Sarah started the meeting with her usual confident tone, but David noticed tiny cracks in her composure. The way she cleared her throat twice before speaking, the slight hesitation when she looked toward his side of the room, the way her hand lingered on her notes longer than necessary. No one else seemed to pick up on it, but David felt every detail like a spotlight. When their eyes accidentally met during the budget report, he looked away so fast he nearly pulled a muscle. She paused mid-sentence for a fraction of a second, just long enough for him to realize she had been caught off guard too. By the time the meeting ended, he was sure half the room suspected something, even if they couldn't place what. As he packed his notebook, his coworker Matt nudged him. "Did something happen between you and the boss? You two kept avoiding eye contact like teenagers in trouble." David nearly choked. "Nothing happened," he insisted, but the denial came out too quickly, too defensive, and Matt's eyebrows shot up in knowing amusement. The worst part was that Matt wasn't the only one to notice the shift. Throughout the day, people found excuses to wander past his desk, subtly trying to observe him or catch a reaction when Sarah walked by. Someone even dropped a stack of papers near him while staring at his face instead of the floor. It would have been comical if it weren't so embarrassing. During lunch, David escaped to the break room, hoping the solitude would help him breathe again. But the universe had other plans. Sarah walked in with a folder in hand, clearly not expecting him there. They both froze like startled deer. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she broke into a small, polite smile. "Mind if I grab some coffee?" "Go ahead," he said quickly, moving aside like the coffee machine might explode if he didn't give her enough space. She poured her drink, but I could feel her trying not to acknowledge the awkwardness. Finally, she let out a soft sigh. "This morning has been interesting." "That's one word for it," he muttered. They shared a quick, mutual laugh, the first comfortable moment of the day. She leaned slightly against the counter, her expression softening. "For what it's worth, I don't want things to feel weird between us. Last night happened by accident. A very strange accident, but still, an accident." "Agreed. And I promise I'm not planning to quit and move to another country." Her eyes sparkled with amusement. "Good, the team would miss you."
Something warm flickered in his chest before either of them could name it. Sarah straightened her coat, preparing to leave. Just as she turned toward the door, she looked back at him with a more genuine smile. Something unspoken, but meaningful. Let's just pretend we both sat at the wrong table. Start fresh. Deal. She left the room, and for the first time all day, David felt the tight knot in his stomach loosen. But the awkwardness wasn't done with him. That afternoon, Mia called during his break to tell her that she had told Mrs. Ramirez all about Daddy's surprise date, which only added to his confusion about how the universe had decided to expose him from all angles. Even his child was joining the conspiracy. By the end of the workday, the chaotic embarrassment had softened into something unexpected. He couldn't deny the strange shift between him and Sarah, a mix of tension, familiarity, and something else he didn't dare define, something almost hopeful. When he walked out of the office that evening, he realized he had spent the entire day thinking about her smile, her laugh, and the way she had looked when she said the team would miss him. The accidental date had changed something, even if neither of them knew what came next. All he knew was that the tension had stopped feeling like discomfort. It had started feeling like possibility.
The following week unfolded with a slow but undeniable shift between David and Sarah. Something so subtle that neither of them acknowledged it out loud, yet so constant that everyone around them sensed it without being told. It started small, little moments, tiny interactions that would have gone unnoticed before their accidental date, but now carried a quiet warmth that neither of them seemed capable of hiding. On Monday morning, when David walked into the office, gripping a coffee he desperately needed after a sleepless night, helping Mia with a last-minute school project, he was surprised to find an extra cup on his desk. A sticky note sat on the lid, written in tidy handwriting he recognized instantly. "You look like someone who didn't sleep. Thought you might need this." No name, no signature, nothing identifying. But it didn't need any. He glanced up just in time to see Sarah stepping into her office, not looking back, but clearly aware he had seen the note. The gesture wasn't romantic, not in any obvious sense, but it was thoughtful in a way that nudged something tender inside him. He picked up the cup, smiling like someone who'd just been handed a small piece of hope he didn't know he needed. Throughout the day, he caught himself glancing toward her office more often than usual. And once or twice, he caught her looking back before quickly shifting her attention to her laptop. It was subtle, polite, professional, but warm. Too warm to be dismissed. As the days passed, the workload picked up dramatically when a major client presentation suddenly moved up on the calendar, sending the entire team into a quiet panic. Late nights became unavoidable. And soon, David found himself staying at the office long after sunset, tapping through spreadsheets while the hum of the building fell into stillness. He expected these late nights to be solitary, but every time he stayed late, Sarah seemed to be there too. Sometimes in her office, sometimes sitting at the conference table with her laptop and a cup of tea. On Wednesday evening, the two of them ended up working side by side at the long table near the window, papers spread across the surface like puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled. At first, they focused on the work in silence, but slowly the quiet softened into easy conversation. They joked about how the office fridge seemed to contain more abandoned takeout boxes than actual food, and Sarah admitted she once forgot leftovers there so long she had to throw the entire container away without opening it. David laughed harder than the joke deserved, but only because the stress of the week had built up inside him until he needed something, anything, to release it. She laughed too, covering her mouth like she always did when a laugh slipped out unexpectedly. Soon, the conversation deepened without either of them noticing. They talked about leadership, how she often felt she had to be tougher than she wanted just to be taken seriously, and how David sometimes felt invisible because he didn't fit the loud, competitive mold of the rest of the team. She confessed that she envied how naturally he connected with people, how he managed to make even the most stressful days feel manageable. He admitted that he admired her confidence, her ability to command a room without raising her voice. For the first time, they spoke to each other not as boss and employee, not as two people caught in a strange misunderstanding, but as equals, two adults trying to make sense of responsibilities that sometimes felt bigger than they were. Their voices softened, their smiles grew easier. Something unspoken hovered between them, warm and steady. When they finally wrapped up for the night,
Sarah closed her laptop with a tired sigh and leaned back in her chair. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for staying late, for making this week a little easier." David shrugged with a small smile. "You make it easier too." For a moment, their eyes held in a way neither of them dared to acknowledge aloud. The next day only deepened that growing connection. During a meeting with another department, one team lead tried to blame David's group for a delay that wasn't their fault. And without hesitation, Sarah calmly but firmly defended him, laying out the timeline, correcting the accusation, and giving credit where it was due. She did it professionally, without favoritism, but everyone in the room knew it took intentional effort to defend someone so thoroughly. After the meeting, she caught his eye for a second, almost asking if he was okay. And he gave her a small nod that meant both gratitude and something slightly more personal. Later that afternoon, when a technical issue nearly derailed the presentation slides, David jumped in quickly to fix the formatting, and Sarah watched him with an appreciative smile, her expression warmer than a simple thanks could ever match. They were falling into a rhythm, protecting each other, supporting each other, balancing each other in ways neither of them expected. By Friday, the project was complete, the presentation was approved, and the entire office buzzed with relief. But the real moment, the moment everything shifted from connection into possibility, came that evening when most of the staff headed home early. David lingered at his desk, packing up slowly, and Sarah walked over with the relaxed posture of someone who had finally exhaled after a long week. "You survived," she said with a small, tired smile. "Barely, but I think we make a pretty good team." She paused at that, her expression softening in a way that made the silence between them feel weighted with something fragile and real. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think we do." The office was quiet around them, the sun setting against the windows in warm orange tones, casting long shadows across the floor. It felt like a story they hadn't realized they were writing. Sarah looked down, hesitating before she spoke again. "About the other night, I keep thinking about it." David froze, not in fear this time, but in the surprise of hearing words he hadn't let himself hope for. She looked up at him, her eyes steady. It could have been a disaster, and yet, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. David felt the meaning settle between them like a truth they were both trying to understand. He stepped a little closer. Not too close, not inappropriate, just close enough to show he wasn't afraid of whatever this was becoming. "I've been thinking about it too," he admitted. She smiled, a soft, vulnerable smile that showed more sincerity than any expression he had seen from her since their accidental date. The air between them felt charged, lighter than it had all week, filled with a sense of something beginning rather than ending. They didn't touch. They didn't cross any lines. But the unspoken energy lingered as they gathered their things and walked out of the office together. And in the quiet of that moment, David realized something he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. Maybe the mix-up at the cafe wasn't just an embarrassing story. Maybe it was the start of something neither of them had been brave enough to look for.
The following week felt surprisingly calm for David, as though the storm of awkwardness that once loomed over him and Sarah had finally settled into a warm, steady breeze that carried something new beneath its surface. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, but it was there, quiet, gentle, and impossible to ignore. Every day brought small moments that nudged their connection forward, a shared smile across the office floor, a quick laugh in the hallway, brief conversations that somehow felt more meaningful than entire evenings he'd spent with people in the past. Still, neither of them addressed the unspoken question lingering between them. They simply moved through their days with a soft awareness of each other, as though walking on parallel paths that kept edging closer. By Friday, the week had carried enough subtle tension that David felt both hopeful and uncertain. He didn't want to misread anything. He didn't want to assume she was feeling the same shift he was. Yet, every time their eyes met, he caught something in her expression. Something thoughtful, something warm, something almost curious. It was as if they were both standing at the edge of a decision neither had the courage to make first. The moment everything changed came late that afternoon, after most of the staff had already trickled out of the office for an early start to the weekend. David stayed behind to finish a report that was due Monday, typing slowly as the office grew quieter around him. The setting sun cast long streaks of gold across the carpet, softening the room into a peaceful glow. He didn't hear anyone approach until a gentle knock tapped on the side of his cubicle wall. "You still here?" Sarah asked, leaning in with a light smile that carried traces of the week's exhaustion. David looked up, surprised to see her. "Just trying to finish this report," he said. "If I don't do it now, I'll spend all weekend thinking about it." She laughed softly. "I know the feeling." She hesitated for a moment, glancing around the empty office before stepping inside and leaning against the edge of his desk. The sight of her so relaxed, so unguarded, made his breath catch for a second. This wasn't his boss. This was the woman he'd accidentally shared a date with, the woman who had shared late-night conversations and warm glances and quiet encouragement all week, the woman he was beginning to feel something for, something real. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally, her voice soft but steady. David nodded, trying to hide how fast his heart was beating. Sarah lowered her gaze briefly, gathering her thoughts before looking back at him. "Have you thought about that night? The cafe?" He swallowed. The question landed gently but carried a weight he had been holding for days. "Yeah, I've thought about it a lot," he admitted quietly. Her eyes searched his, and for the first time he saw something vulnerable in her expression, something that made him realize she wasn't approaching this as a boss or a leader, but as a woman trying to find the right words. "She keep replaying it," she said, her tone slow and thoughtful. "Not because it was embarrassing, even though it absolutely was, but because I didn't expect to enjoy it as much as I did." David felt his breath leave him in a quiet rush. "Me neither." She smiled, a small, genuine smile that carried more truth than anything she had said all day. "And all week I've been wondering if maybe that night wasn't such a mistake after all." Silence stretched between them, warm and electric. David straightened a little, his hands resting still on the edge of his keyboard. "What are you saying?" he asked gently, giving her room to speak without pressure. Sarah exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing. "I'm saying that I've been thinking about what it would have been like if we hadn't sat at the wrong table, if we had actually planned it, if it hadn't been an accident." Her voice softened, almost a whisper. "And part of me wonders what would happen if we tried again, intentionally." The words settled around them like a spark, waiting for someone brave enough to fan it into something bigger. David's chest tightened, not with fear, but with something bright and warm. He hadn't let himself imagine hearing those words from her, not out loud. "I've wondered that too," he said honestly. She looked relieved at his answer, her shoulders easing as though she had worried he might reject the idea. But then her expression shifted, touched by a quiet caution. "I don't want to make things complicated. And I don't want you to feel uncomfortable because of the role I hold. This isn't something I take lightly." "I know," he said, "and I wouldn't want to do anything that crosses a line either. But," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "but I can't pretend I didn't feel something that night, or this week." Her eyes lifted slightly, filled with something hopeful. He continued, "And if there's even a small chance this could be something real, I think it's worth exploring." Sarah nodded slowly, absorbing his words. The moment stretched, warm and delicate, as though the entire office had stilled to listen. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded card. She hesitated before placing it gently on his desk. "Then maybe," she said quietly, "we can explore it outside of office hours." David unfolded the card. It was simple, a cafe address, different from the one where their accident happened, and a time written neatly underneath. Sunday, 7 p.m. His breath caught. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an invitation. A real one. He looked up at her, unable to stop the smile forming on his face. "Are you sure?" She returned the smile, soft and steady. "I wouldn't have written it down if I wasn't." For a long, charged moment, they simply looked at each other, the distance between them filled with possibility. Then, Sarah glanced toward the hallway, the professional part of her re-emerging. "I should let you finish your report," she said lightly. "And I should pretend I wasn't here for as long as I was." He laughed quietly. "I'll erase the security footage." "Please do," she joked, before turning to leave. When she reached the doorway, she looked back one last time, her eyes warm. "Sunday," she confirmed, her voice filled with a careful, excited promise. "Sunday," David repeated. As she walked away, the quiet of the office returned, yet something felt entirely new. He stared at the card in his hand, feeling a slow smile spread across his face, the kind that came not from surprise but from hope finally becoming something real. What started as a mistake had become a moment he couldn't stop thinking about, and now, for the first time, he felt the thrill of wondering not what if, but what comes next. If you enjoyed this story and want to see what happens when their real date finally happens, hit like and subscribe to Drew Daily Stories. Share your thoughts in the comments. Should David and Sarah go on an actual date? Your engagement helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way.